So what I'm referring to as phase one of each day is useful for acquiring certain habits, but there are other phases of the day, and those turn out to be useful for acquiring other types of habits. Phase two, as I mentioned, is about, again, these aren't specifics, but about 9 to 14 or 15 hours after waking. During this phase of the day, because of the circadian shifts in our biology, the amount of dopamine and norepinephrine that's circulating in our brain and bloodstream tends to start to come down, and levels of cortisol tend to start to come down. That's the ideal circumstance. In fact, you don't really want elevated cortisol late in the day. That's actually a signature of depression and anxiety and a number of other unfortunate things. So 9 to 14 hours after waking, dopamine and norepinephrine and cortisol are starting to taper down just naturally, and a different neuromodulator, serotonin, is starting to rise. Serotonin is definitely going to be highest in this second half of the day and tends to lend itself to a more relaxed state of being. Now, of course, I do realize that some people are less of morning people and find that they really come alive and awake in the afternoon, but most people don't fall into that category. Most people feel more alert early in the day, even anxious early in the day, and then as the afternoon progresses, they tend to be a bit more sleepy, a bit more relaxed, a bit more calm. There are certain things that we all can and should do during this phase two of each day that lend themselves to a state of mind and a state of body that is going to be beneficial for the generation and consolidation of certain types of habits. What are those things? First of all, as the day goes on, you should try, if you can, to start tapering the amount of light that you're viewing. Now, this doesn't mean putting yourself into dim light at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's certainly not the case. Simply that you want to start tapering off the amount of really bright light that you're getting, unless it's sunlight. Talked about this before on the podcast, but if you haven't heard, viewing the sun as it's at what we call low solar angle, so as it's headed toward the horizon, you don't necessarily have to watch the sunset, although that can be nice, but getting some sunlight in your eyes in the second half of the day can also be beneficial for a number of brain systems and psychological systems. So you can get some sunlight in your eyes, you can certainly have artificial lights on, but you want to start dimming those lights and bringing them actually physically lower in the room, because the neurons in your eye that view the upper visual field, they actually trigger this alertness mechanism in the brain and body. And in the second half of the day, even if you're humming around and doing work at 3 and 4 or 5 or even 7 p.m., you are probably headed towards sleep a few hours later. So things like limiting the total amount of light if you can, things like NSDR, non-sleep deep rest, another thing that I've talked about on this podcast. If you haven't heard about this before, non-sleep deep rest is an umbrella term for things like meditation, for yoga nidra, a very powerful science-supported tool for teaching you how to relax, things like self-hypnosis, which might sound a little kooky to some of you, but actually is a clinically based tool for which there's a lot of scientific literature. If you're interested in that, there's a great free resource called Reveri, REVERI.com. There's a app for both Apple and Android. This is an app that was developed by colleagues of mine and researchers at Stanford School of Medicine. You can do these short 15-minute self-hypnosis scripts, as they're called, that can teach you how to relax yourself. There's even ones for focus, for sleep, for chronic pain. Again, all very strongly supported by quality peer-reviewed literature. So things like Reveri, meditation, things like heat and sauna, hot baths, hot showers. Those are terrific things to do in the second half of the day. They tend to support this serotonergic or high serotonin-like state and lend themselves to more calm and relaxation. For those of you that are interested in supplementation, there's always ashwagandha, which reduces cortisol. Again, peaks in cortisol late in the afternoon and evening are associated with depression, anxiety, and so forth. Ashwagandha is a pretty potent cortisol inhibiting tool. I personally don't use it very often, and I caution people about using it for longer than 2-week periods of time without taking some breaks. You can look up more about ashwagandha on examine.com. There's a lot of terrific literature with links to studies there. But basically, this phase 2 of the day is one in which you're alert, you are present, you are working, you are engaging socially, you're cooking dinner, probably paying attention to a number of things, but you should really be trying to taper off your stress level. So how do you leverage phase 2 of the day for habit formation? Well, given what we know about the neurochemistry of learning and memory, given what we know about task formation and its reliance on certain forms of neuroplasticity, this second half of the day is a terrific time to take on habits and things that you're already doing that require very little override of limbic friction. So these might be things that you could categorize in common terms as kind of mellower activities. It might be journaling. It might be that you already are performing music, or I should say practicing music regularly, but that there's a particular type of music that is hard for you, or that you're working on a particular piece of music, or you're trying to learn a language, something that's a little bit challenging, but doesn't require a ton of energy in order to override that limbic friction. The second half of the day is a much better time to do that. Less resistance, as we might say. But of course, resistance has a neural substrate. And the reason for doing those things in the second part of the day, the so-called phase 2, as I've called it, part of the day, is because your ability to override resistance is really diminished in this second phase of the day. Some of you might say, well, wait, I like to exercise in the second half of the day. That's actually when I have the most energy. That's when I feel warmer. I'm not a morning exerciser. That's absolutely fine. But what I'm referring to is the acquisition of new behaviors and placing those consistently at the second half of the day in order to engage this task bracketing mechanisms that I talked about before. One of the hallmark features of those basal ganglia circuits for go and no-go is that they are associated with certain neurochemicals, dopamine and serotonin, acetylcholine, and other neurochemicals. And by placing particular habits at particular phases of the day, those neurochemical states start to be associated with the leaning in and the process of beginning and, as I mentioned, ending those particular habits. And in doing so, they shift the whole nervous system toward being able to predict that certain things are going to happen at particular times of day, that you're going to be leaning very hard against limbic friction early in the day in phase 1. And that you're going to be doing things that require less conscious override of limbic friction in phase 2. And in doing so, set up this task bracketing system so that the individual habits that you're learning or that you're trying to learn have a much greater probability of being executed and consolidated, meaning that pretty soon they will just naturally become reflexive. And as with phase 1, many of the things that I mentioned that support this, what I'm calling a serotonergic state or a more relaxed state in phase 2, things like seeing sunlight in the afternoon, but not a lot of bright light from artificial sources, things like NSDR, things like heat and sauna, hot baths, etc., ashwagandha. Again, all of those things themselves could be habits that you're trying to adopt, right? In that case, do those if you'd like to explore them. They are quite beneficial for a number of reasons, not just related to execution of particular habits in phase 2 of the day, but also for improving quality of sleep and consolidating any learning that you might have triggered early in the day. I've talked about that before, but just briefly as a relevant aside, neuroplasticity involves triggering the neuroplasticity, setting it in motion, but the actual rewiring of the brain and the reconfiguration of neurons that will allow that learning to be reflexive, that actually occurs during states of deep rest, like NSDR and like deep sleep. And I should just mention, for those of you that can only exercise or prefer to exercise in phase 2 of the day, right, 9 to 14 hours or 15 hours after waking, that's absolutely fine. However, because of the importance of sleep, and in particular deep sleep throughout the night for not just neuroplasticity, but recovery of muscle and other tissues that are taxed during physical exercise. If you do train in phase 2, I highly recommend that you start doing some sort of NSDR type activity after you train within an hour or two, because that will allow you to taper down and relax so that you can get into the next phase we're going to talk about, which is phase 3.